The morning sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Richard Chen stepped out of his luxury apartment building. At 36, he had everything money could buy. A corner office at the top investment firm in the city, a wardrobe of designer suits, and a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park. But as he walked down the busy street toward his office, a hollow feeling followed him like a shadow. Richard checked his watch, an expensive timepiece his father had given him when he made partner, and realized he was running early for once. The board meeting wasn't until 9, so he decided to stop at his favorite coffee shop. The baristas knew his order by heart, a double espresso, no sugar. As he approached the cafe, he noticed a woman sitting on a bench nearby. She wasn't like the other homeless people he usually hurried past. There was something about her posture, straight-backed despite her circumstances, that caught his attention. She wasn't asking for money. Instead, she was reading a tattered paperback, completely absorbed in its pages. Richard hesitated. He normally wouldn't stop, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the book in her hands. He could just make out the title, a classic he'd studied in college. Or maybe it was simply that on this particular morning, the loneliness of his perfect life felt heavier than usual. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than his usual boardroom tone. "Would you like some coffee? Or maybe breakfast?" The woman looked up, surprised. She was older than he'd first thought, probably in her mid-40s, with deep brown eyes that held both wariness and wisdom. "I don't need your pity," she said quietly, closing her book. "It's not pity," Richard replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I just thought you might want something warm to drink. It's getting colder these days." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine his real motives. Finally, she nodded. "My name is Denise," she said, standing up and tucking the book into a worn backpack. "And yes, I would appreciate some coffee." "Thank you." Inside the cafe, the usual morning crowd hustled around them. Richard noticed how people glanced at them. A wealthy Asian man in a tailored suit and a homeless black woman in layers of weathered clothing, then quickly looked away. He felt a flash of anger at their judgment, then shame at realizing he would have done the same thing yesterday. They found a small table in the corner. Richard ordered his espresso and, after asking what she wanted, a large breakfast sandwich and hot chocolate for Denise. "So," he said awkwardly as they waited for their order, "you like classic literature?" Denise smiled slightly. "I was an English teacher in another life." This surprised him. "Really, where did you teach?" "I taught high school for 15 years. Advanced placement English literature at Washington High." She took a sip of the hot chocolate that had just arrived. "I loved my job." "What happened?" Richard asked, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, that's personal." "You don't have to—" "Life happened," she interrupted. "My husband got sick, cancer. The insurance covered some, but not all. You know how it is. We spent everything we had on treatments, sold our house, drained our savings." Her voice remained steady, matter-of-fact. "He died anyway. Then I got laid off when the school district cut the budget. Couldn't find another position. Couldn't pay rent. And here we are." Richard didn't know what to say. In his world, problems were solved with money or connections. The idea of losing everything despite doing everything right seemed impossible. Yet here was Denise, clearly educated and intelligent, living on the streets. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Denise shrugged. "Everyone has their struggles." "I'm sure you have yours." Richard almost laughed. What could he possibly complain about to this woman? That his last vacation to the Maldives had been rained out. That the dating scene was exhausting when you couldn't tell if people liked you or your bank account. But something in her expression made him answer honestly. "I guess I'm just lonely," he admitted. "I have everything I thought I wanted, but no one to share it with." "Ah," Denise nodded. "That's a different kind of poverty." They talked as they ate. Richard was surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. Denise spoke about books she loved, students who had touched her life, and places she'd always wanted to visit. She didn't complain about her situation or ask him for anything more than the breakfast he'd already bought. Richard found himself telling her about growing up as the son of immigrants who pushed him to succeed, about the pressure he felt to live up to their sacrifices, about his recent promotion that had left him with even less time for a personal life. "What about family?" Denise asked. "Someone special?" Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced down to see a notification that made his stomach tighten. He turned the phone screen down on the table. That bad, huh? Denise said with a knowing look. My ex just sent me a wedding invitation, he said, still processing it himself. We were together for 3 years. I thought we would get married, but she said I was too focused on work. That she felt invisible. She left me 8 months ago. And now she's marrying someone else, Denise finished for him. Richard nodded. The wedding's next month. I don't know why she's inviting me. Maybe to show me what I missed out on. Or maybe she values the friendship you had before things got romantic, Denise suggested. Not everything is about making a point. Richard considered this. It hadn't occurred to him that Lily might genuinely want him there. Not as some kind of statement, but simply because he had been important to her. Will you go? Denise asked. I don't know. Going alone to your ex's wedding seems pathetic. Only if you feel pathetic about it, Denise said. It's all in how you carry yourself. Richard looked at her, really looked at her. Despite everything life had thrown at her, Denise carried herself with dignity. Even in her worn clothes, with her belongings in a backpack, she had a presence that commanded respect. A crazy thought entered his mind. Would you... He started, then stopped. It was ridiculous. He couldn't possibly ask, would I what? Denise raised an eyebrow. Nothing. It's a stupid idea. I've heard a lot of stupid ideas in my time. Try me. Richard took a deep breath. Would you come to the wedding with me? Denise stared at him, then burst out laughing. A rich, genuine sound that made several people turn to look. You're asking me, a homeless woman you just met, to be your date to your ex's fancy wedding? She shook her head in disbelief. You really are desperate. Richard's face flushed with embarrassment. I told you it was stupid. Didn't say I wouldn't do it, Denise replied, surprising him. Just pointing out the absurdity. Why would you want me there? It was a fair question. Why was he asking this stranger to accompany him? Because in the 2 hours we've been talking, you've made me feel more understood than people I've known for years, he said honestly. And because I think you could use a few days of decent meals and a warm bed, even if it's just temporary. Denise's expression grew serious. I'm not a charity case, Richard. I know that. This would be a favor to me, not the other way around. You'd be saving me from having to face my ex and all our old friends alone. He hesitated. I'm not trying to be your white knight or whatever. I like talking to you. And the wedding's at this fancy resort upstate. You could have your own room, nice food, whatever you need. Denise was quiet for a long moment. When exactly is this wedding? 4 weeks from now. The weekend of the 18th. She seemed to be calculating something in her mind. And you'd need me for how long? Just 3 days. Friday to Sunday. Denise tapped her fingers against her mug. If I agree to this madness, I have conditions. Name them, Richard said, hardly believing she was actually considering it. I don't want charity. This is a business arrangement. You need a date, I provide a service. You pay me for my time. That seems fair. And I need somewhere to stay until then. A cheap room somewhere, nothing fancy. Just safe, Richard nodded. I can arrange that. And I need appropriate clothes. I can't show up looking like this. Of course, Denise took another sip of her hot chocolate, studying him over the rim of the mug. Why are you really doing this, Richard? The truth. He thought about it. I guess I'm tired of being alone. And maybe I want to show Lily that I'm not just the workaholic she left behind. That I can connect with people too. Even if it's not real. Is anything really real in my world? Richard asked with a sad smile. At least this would be honest in its dishonesty. Denise extended her hand across the table. Then you've got yourself a deal, Richard Chen. I'll be the best fake date you've ever had. As they shook hands, Richard's phone buzzed again with another message. He glanced at it and saw it was from his assistant, reminding him about the board meeting. I have to go, he said, standing up and leaving money on the table for the bill. Can we meet here tomorrow, same time? We can figure out the details then, Denise nodded. I'll be here. As Richard walked out of the cafe toward his office, he couldn't believe what he'd just done. He'd invited a homeless woman to be his date to his ex's wedding. It was crazy, impulsive, completely out of character for someone who planned every detail of his life. And yet, for the first time in months, he felt a spark of something like excitement. He had no idea what would happen next, but somehow, he knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The next morning, Richard arrived at the cafe 20 minutes early. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with second thoughts about his impulsive offer. What was he thinking, inviting a stranger to his ex's wedding? Yet as crazy as it seemed, he couldn't bring himself to back out. He ordered his usual espresso and waited, checking his watch every few minutes. At 5 minutes past their agreed time, he began to worry that Denise wouldn't show up. At 10 minutes past, he was convinced she'd changed her mind. He couldn't blame her. The whole arrangement was bizarre. Just as he was about to leave, the door opened and Denise walked in. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but she'd clearly made an effort to neaten her appearance. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back and her clothes, though worn, were clean. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. The shelter was crowded last night. Took forever to get a shower this morning. Richard felt a stab of guilt. While he'd been tossing and turning in his king-sized bed with its expensive sheets, she'd been fighting for space in a shelter. "It's fine," he said. "I'm just glad you came." "I keep my promises," Denise replied, "though I still think this whole plan is ridiculous." "You can back out if you want," Richard offered, half hoping she would, half hoping she wouldn't. Denise studied his face. "You're having second thoughts, aren't you?" She shrugged. "I don't have much to lose. A warm bed for a few weeks and some cash when it's over. Seems like a good deal to me." She leaned forward. "The question is, are you sure you want to do this? Take a homeless woman to your fancy ex's wedding?" Richard considered her question. Was he sure? No, but something about Denise intrigued him. Maybe it was her directness, so different from the carefully calculated conversations he was used to. Or maybe he was just tired of playing by the rules that had left him successful but alone. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm sure," Denise nodded slowly. "All right then. Let's talk details." Over the next hour, they sketched out a plan. Richard would rent a small apartment for Denise for the month leading up to the wedding. Nothing extravagant, but clean and safe. He would give her money for food and necessities, and they would go shopping for appropriate clothes for the wedding. "We also need a story," Richard said. "People will ask how we met." "We tell the truth," Denise replied simply. "We met at a cafe. You bought me breakfast. We started talking and hit it off. And the part where you're homeless?" Denise finished for him. "We leave that out. I'm just a woman you met who used to be a teacher." "That's true enough," Richard nodded. "It was simpler that way. What about your current situation? Won't people wonder what you do now?" "I'm between jobs," Denise said with a wry smile. "Also true. And I'm staying with a friend for a while. That friend happens to be you, but they don't need to know that part." As they finalized their plan, Richard felt a weight lifting. Maybe this crazy idea could actually work. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small envelope. "This is for you. A deposit, let's call it." Denise opened the envelope and her eyes widened at the stack of bills inside. "This is too much." "It's what I think your time is worth," Richard said firmly. "Use it for whatever you need." She hesitated, then tucked the envelope into her backpack. "Thank you." 2 hours later, they were viewing a small furnished apartment in a decent neighborhood. The landlord, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patel, looked skeptical when they first arrived, but warmed up as Richard explained they needed a short-term rental for his friend visiting from out of town. "1 month only?" Mrs. Patel confirmed. "Yes," Richard nodded. "And I'll pay the full amount up front plus security deposit." That sealed the deal. After signing the paperwork and handing over a check that made Denise wince, they were left alone in the apartment. It was nothing special. A 1-bedroom with basic furniture, a small kitchen and a tiny bathroom. But to Denise, it clearly felt like a palace. She walked slowly through each room, touching surfaces as if to make sure they were real. "There's a grocery store down the block," Richard said, breaking the silence. "We should get you some food and supplies." Denise turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you really doing this, Richard? And don't give me that line about needing a date for the wedding. You could find plenty of women willing to go with you." Richard sat down on the small sofa. "Honestly, I don't know. Maybe I'm tired of my perfectly scheduled life where nothing unexpected ever happens. Maybe I want to do something good for someone else without any real benefit to myself." He looked up at her. "Or maybe I just like talking to you. It's been a long time since I had a conversation that didn't revolve around investment strategies or corporate politics." Denise sat beside him. "Well, whatever your reasons, I'm grateful. But I need you to understand something. I didn't choose to be homeless. Life knocked me down hard and I couldn't get back up. But I'm still the same person I was before. A teacher, a reader, someone who loves discussing ideas and books and the world. I don't want your pity. I don't pity you, Richard said honestly. If anything, I admire you. I'm not sure I would have your strength if I lost everything. A small smile crossed Denise's face. You'd be surprised what you can handle when you have no choice. She stood up. Now let's get that food. I haven't had a home-cooked meal in longer than I care to remember. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Richard continued his work at the investment firm, but his evenings took on a new pattern. Instead of working late and returning to his empty penthouse, he found himself stopping by Denise's apartment several times a week. Sometimes they would cook dinner together, simple meals that Denise taught him to prepare. Other times they would just talk over takeout, discussing books or current events or sharing stories from their very different lives. One evening, Richard arrived with a handful of shopping bags. We need to get you outfitted for the wedding, he explained. I wasn't sure of your size, so I got a few options. Denise looked through the clothes. Elegant dresses from high-end stores, price tags still attached. She held up a deep blue gown with a simple classic cut. This must have cost a fortune, she said, running her fingers over the fabric. Richard shrugged. Consider it part of our arrangement. Denise tried on the dresses, modeling each one for Richard's opinion. The blue one fit her perfectly, highlighting her regal posture and bringing out the warmth in her brown skin. That's the one, Richard said when she emerged wearing it. You look beautiful. Denise blushed slightly the first time he'd seen her flustered. It feels strange wearing something this nice after so long in second-hand clothes. You deserve nice things, Richard said simply. As the wedding date approached, they spent more time together preparing for the weekend. Richard taught Denise about his work and his background so she could talk convincingly about his life. She told him more about her teaching career and her love of literature, stories he could share if asked how they connected. The night before they were set to drive upstate to the resort, Richard found himself unable to sleep. He paced his penthouse wondering if he was making a huge mistake. What if someone saw through their charade? What if Lily was hurt by his bringing a date? What if Denise felt uncomfortable among his wealthy friends? His phone buzzed with a text message. It was Denise. Can't sleep either, she'd written. Remember, it's just a weekend. We'll get through it together. Richard smiled at her message. Somehow, in just a few weeks, this woman he'd met by chance had become something he hadn't had in a long time. A true friend. The next morning, he pulled up in front of Denise's apartment building in his sleek black car. She was waiting outside with a small suitcase, new, bought with the money he'd given her. She looked different. Her hair had been styled in a sophisticated updo, and she wore a simple but elegant outfit. But the biggest change was in her demeanor. There was a confidence in the way she carried herself, a spark that had been muted when they first met. Ready for this? Richard asked as he took her suitcase and placed it in the trunk. Denise took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. She looked at him with a half smile. How about you? Ready to face your ex with a complete stranger on your arm? Richard laughed. You're hardly a stranger anymore. As they drove out of the city toward the countryside, Richard realized it was true. In just a few weeks, Denise had gone from a stranger to someone he trusted, someone whose opinion he valued, someone he genuinely enjoyed spending time with. What had started as an impulsive, slightly crazy idea had turned into something neither of them had expected, a real friendship across the vast divide of their different worlds. Now they were headed to a weekend that would test that friendship in ways neither of them could anticipate. The wedding of Richard's ex-girlfriend awaited them, along with all the emotions and complications such an event would bring. What neither of them knew was that the wedding weekend would change both their lives in ways they couldn't imagine, and it would have nothing to do with Richard's ex at all. The resort was even more magnificent than Richard had described. Nestled among rolling hills with mountains in the distance, the main building was an elegant stone structure that looked like it belonged in a European countryside. Perfectly manicured gardens surrounded it, and a sparkling lake shimmered in the afternoon sun. As Richard pulled up to the entrance, Denise took a deep breath. Having second thoughts? He asked, noticing her tension. A few hundred, she admitted with a nervous laugh. This place is a lot. We can still turn around, Richard offered, though they both knew they wouldn't. Denise straightened her shoulders. No, we made a deal. I'm not backing out now. A young man in a crisp uniform approached to take their car and luggage. Richard handed over his keys and gave Denise a reassuring smile. Remember, you belong here as much as anyone else. That's a nice thought, she whispered as they walked toward the entrance. But we both know it's not true. The lobby was a grand space with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and marble floors. Well-dressed guests milled about, some clearly there for the wedding. Richard felt Denise stiffen beside him as several people turned to look at them. Richard Chen, a loud voice called from across the lobby. A tall man with graying hair at his temples strode toward them, arms outstretched. I didn't think you'd actually show up. Hello, Thomas, Richard said, accepting the man's enthusiastic handshake. Of course I came. Lily and I are still friends. Right, friends, Thomas winked, then turned his attention to Denise. And who might this lovely lady be? Richard placed his hand lightly on Denise's back. This is Denise Williams. Denise, this is Thomas Parker, an old college friend. Denise extended her hand with a grace that surprised Richard. Pleasure to meet you. Thomas took her hand, holding it a moment longer than necessary. The pleasure is all mine. I must say, Richard, you've been keeping secrets. Where have you been hiding this beautiful woman? We met recently, Richard said smoothly. At a cafe. Well, aren't you full of surprises? Thomas grinned. Listen, everyone's gathering for drinks on the terrace in an hour. You two should join us. After they checked in and a bellhop had shown them to their rooms, connecting suites with a shared balcony overlooking the lake, Denise sank onto a plush armchair. That wasn't so bad, she said. Thomas is easy, Richard replied, loosening his tie. Wait until you meet the rest of them. Denise stood and walked to the window, taking in the breathtaking view. Why are you so worried? They're your friends, aren't they? Richard joined her at the window. They were our friends, mine and Lily's. When we broke up, most of them stayed closer to her. Why? Denise asked, turning to face him. I was always the odd one out, he explained, the workaholic who missed dinners and canceled weekend trips. Lily was the fun one, the one who organized get-togethers and remembered birthdays. He shrugged. When she said I was emotionally unavailable, they all nodded in agreement. Were you? Denise asked quietly. Emotionally unavailable? Richard looked out at the mountains in the distance. Probably. My parents sacrificed everything to give me opportunities. Failing wasn't an option. So I worked all the time, and now I have everything they wanted for me, he said with a sad smile. And I've never felt more alone. The terrace was crowded with guests when they arrived. Richard recognized most of them, old friends, colleagues of Lily's, a few family members. He felt a knot form in his stomach as they turned to stare. Denise sensed his discomfort and slipped her hand into his. Breathe, she whispered. We've got this. Her touch calmed him. They made their way through the crowd, Richard introducing Denise to people who greeted her with varying degrees of curiosity and surprise. Is that who I think it is? A woman's voice called out. Richard turned to see Lily approaching. Radiant in a simple white dress, her future husband beside her. Lily, Richard said, his voice surprisingly steady. Congratulations, she embraced him warmly. I'm so glad you came. I wasn't sure you would. She turned to Denise with open curiosity. And you brought someone. This is Denise, Richard said. Denise, this is Lily and her fiancé, David. It's wonderful to meet you, Denise said with genuine warmth. Richard has told me so much about you. All good things, I hope, Lily laughed, then leaned in to whisper to Richard. She's lovely. I'm happy for you. Before Richard could respond, a commotion near the entrance to the terrace caught everyone's attention. A flustered-looking wedding planner was engaged in an intense conversation with the resort manager. What's going on? Lily asked, moving toward them. The wedding planner turned to her with a distressed expression. I'm so sorry, but we've just received word that your pianist has been in a car accident. Oh no. Are they okay? Lily asked, concern evident in her voice. Yes, just minor injuries, but they won't be able to make it tomorrow, the planner explained. We're trying to find a replacement, but on such short notice, and Lily's face fell. But the music was going to be a centerpiece of the ceremony. My grandmother's favorite piece. David wrapped an arm around her shoulders. We'll figure something out, honey. As the crowd buzzed with concern and suggestions, Richard noticed Denise had gone very still beside him. What is it? he asked quietly. Denise hesitated, then said in a low voice, "I can play." Richard stared at her. "You play piano?" She nodded. "I told you I taught music before I switched to English. I was a pianist first. How good are you?" A small, proud smile crossed her face. "Very." Richard looked at Lily's worried expression, then back at Denise. "You should offer. Are you crazy?" Denise hissed. "I'm supposed to be your date, not the entertainment. If you can help, why wouldn't you?" Richard asked. "Unless you're not actually as good as you say." Denise's eyes narrowed at the challenge. "Fine, but if this backfires, it's on you." She straightened her dress and walked confidently toward Lily and the wedding planner. Richard watched, heart pounding, as she introduced herself and made her offer. The skepticism on the planner's face was clear, but Lily looked hopeful. After a brief conversation, they all headed inside to the ballroom where the ceremony would take place. A grand piano stood on a small stage at one end. The wedding guests followed, curious about this unexpected development. Denise approached the piano with a calm that Richard hadn't seen from her before. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, she closed her eyes as if reconnecting with a long-lost friend. Then she began to play. The music that filled the room was unlike anything Richard had expected. It was Debussy's Clair de Lune, but played with such sensitivity and emotion that it seemed to transform the very air around them. Denise's fingers moved across the keys with precision and grace, drawing out nuances in the piece that Richard had never noticed before. The room fell completely silent. Every face registered surprise, then awe. Lily's eyes filled with tears as she clutched David's hand. Even the wedding planner stood slack-jawed. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted in applause. Denise looked up, seemingly startled by the reaction, as if she'd been in another world while playing. Lily rushed forward. "That was incredible. Please tell me you'll play for the ceremony." Denise glanced at Richard, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I'd be honored," she said. As guests surrounded Denise, asking questions and offering compliments, Richard stood back, watching with a mixture of pride and confusion. This woman who had been living on the streets, who owned nothing but what she could carry in a backpack, possessed a talent that had moved an entire room to tears. Later that night, after the rehearsal dinner where Denise had been the center of attention, they stood on their shared balcony under a sky full of stars. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked. "About how talented you are?" Denise leaned against the railing. "It wasn't relevant to our arrangement. It wasn't just that you could play. It was extraordinary." She shrugged, but he could see she was pleased by his praise. "Music was my life once. I studied at Juilliard, performed with orchestras, taught master classes." "What happened?" Richard asked softly. "Life," she said simply. "My husband got sick. Bills piled up. I sold my piano to pay for treatments. After he died, I couldn't bring myself to play anymore. It hurt too much." She looked out at the darkened lake. "Today was the first time I've touched a piano in 3 years." Richard was speechless. He'd thought he was helping Denise by giving her shelter and food, but he'd had no idea of the depths of what she had lost. "Tomorrow will be interesting," she said, changing the subject. "Everyone thinks I'm this accomplished musician you're dating, not a homeless woman you hired to be your date." "You are an accomplished musician," Richard pointed out. "Yes, but that's not why I'm here," she reminded him. "Don't forget our deal. After this weekend, I go back to my life and you go back to yours." But as Richard looked at her profile in the moonlight, he wondered if it would really be that simple. Something had shifted between them and within him. The woman he'd invited on a whim out of loneliness and pride had revealed herself to be far more complex and talented than he could have imagined. And tomorrow, she would take center stage at his ex's wedding, playing music that would touch everyone's hearts. No one would ever guess where she had come from or where she might return to when the weekend was over, unless Richard found a way to change that ending. The morning of the wedding dawned with perfect blue skies. Richard woke early and stepped onto the balcony, surprised to find Denise already there, wrapped in the plush hotel robe, a cup of steaming coffee in her hands. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, joining her. She shook her head. "Too nervous. I haven't performed for an audience in years." She took a sip of her coffee. "What if I mess up? What if I freeze?" You won't, Richard said with certainty. I saw you yesterday. When you play, it's like you become someone else. Someone who never doubted herself, never lost anything. Denise gave him a small smile. That's a nice way of putting it. It's true, he insisted. When you were playing, I thought, this is who she really is. Not the woman on the bench with the tattered book. This. Denise looked out at the mountains, thoughtful. Maybe we're all just a collection of moments. The ones where we shine and the ones where we fall. Neither is more real than the other. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was the wedding planner, looking considerably more respectful toward Denise than she had the previous evening. Ms. Williams, I've brought the music for the ceremony if you'd like to review it. Denise followed the planner to the ballroom for a final rehearsal, leaving Richard to get ready for the day. As he showered and dressed in his suit, he found himself thinking about Denise's words. A collection of moments. He wondered which moments defined him, the successful business deals or the lonely nights. The relationships he'd neglected or this strange, unexpected connection with a woman who lived in a world so different from his own. By the time the ceremony was set to begin, the ballroom had been transformed. White flowers adorned every surface and sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a golden glow over the assembled guests. Richard took his seat, feeling strangely nervous on Denise's behalf. He spotted her at the piano wearing the deep blue dress they had chosen together. She looked poised and professional, her fingers resting lightly on the keys as she waited for her cue. As the mothers of the bride and groom were escorted to their seats, Denise began to play. The music was gentle and flowing, filling the room with warmth. When the bridal party entered, she transitioned seamlessly into a more dramatic piece that made Richard's heart swell with emotion. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Lily appeared at the entrance, radiant in her wedding gown. Denise's fingers moved to a new melody, the grandmother's favorite piece that Lily had mentioned. It was a classical composition that Richard didn't recognize, but the effect was magical. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Lily walked down the aisle to meet her soon-to-be husband. Throughout the ceremony, Denise provided subtle musical accompaniment, enhancing every moment with just the right touch. When the couple was pronounced husband and wife, she broke into a joyful, triumphant melody that perfectly captured the celebration. As the guests moved to the reception hall for cocktails before dinner, Richard made his way to Denise, who was surrounded by admirers. That was simply extraordinary, an older woman was saying. Where did you study? Juilliard, Denise replied with quiet pride. I knew it. The woman exclaimed. I'm on the board of the symphony. We must talk about having you perform. Richard waited patiently until the crowd around Denise thinned, then approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. You were amazing, he said, handing her a glass. She accepted it with a slightly trembling hand. Thank you. It felt right, like coming home after a long time away. Before Richard could respond, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s approached them. Excuse me, he said, addressing Denise. I'm Walter Green, the director of the Lawrence Conservatory of Music. Your playing was exceptional. Thank you, Denise said, clearly surprised by the introduction. If you don't mind my asking, where are you teaching now? Denise glanced at Richard, a flicker of panic in her eyes. I'm between positions at the moment. Walter nodded thoughtfully. Well, as it happens, we're looking for someone to join our piano faculty this fall. Our previous instructor is retiring. Would you be interested in discussing the possibility? Denise's mouth opened slightly in shock. Yes, I would be very interested. Excellent. Let's talk after dinner. I'd like to hear more about your background. He handed her a business card before moving away to greet other guests. When he was out of earshot, Denise gripped Richard's arm. Did that just happen? Did the director of the Lawrence Conservatory just offer me a job interview? Richard grinned. He did. And from what I know about Walter Green, he doesn't waste time on pleasantries if he's not serious. But what do I tell him? Denise's voice was strained. That I've been living on the streets? That I haven't played in years until yesterday? That I don't even have a permanent address? You tell him the truth, Richard said simply. That you're an incredibly talented musician who hit hard times but never lost your gift. The rest will work itself out. Denise looked unconvinced, but they were soon swept into the reception dinner, seated at a table with other friends of the bride and groom. Throughout the meal, people stopped by to compliment Denise on her playing, and Richard watched with growing admiration as she handled each interaction with grace and quiet confidence. After dinner, as promised, Walter Green found them again and invited Denise to join him at a quiet table in the corner. Richard watched from a distance as they talked, Denise at first hesitant, then becoming more animated as the conversation continued. "She's quite something, isn't she?" a familiar voice said beside him. Richard turned to find Lily, who had changed from her wedding gown into a simpler white dress for the reception. "She is," Richard agreed. "How did you two meet again?" Lily asked, a hint of suspicion in her voice. Richard considered lying, sticking to the simplified story they had agreed upon. But something stopped him. "I found her reading a book on a bench outside my favorite coffee shop," he said instead. "She was homeless. I bought her breakfast." Lily's eyes widened. "Homeless? But she plays like she should be performing at Carnegie Hall." "She did once. Life knocked her down. Hard." Lily was quiet for a moment, watching Denise across the room. "And you brought her here as your date?" "Why?" Richard shrugged. "At first, because I didn't want to come alone. I wanted to show you I'd moved on." He looked at Lily. "I'm sorry about that. It wasn't fair to her. Or to you. And now?" Lily asked softly. "Now?" Richard looked at Denise again, feeling something shift inside him. "Now I think maybe I was meant to find her. To help her find her way back to who she really is." Lily smiled and touched his arm gently. "That's the Richard I always knew was in there. The one who cares more than he lets on." She nodded toward Denise. "Don't let this one slip away because of work." As Lily moved away to greet other guests, Richard saw Denise stand and shake Walter's hand. She walked toward Richard with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Well?" he asked when she reached him. "How did it go?" "He wants me to audition formally next week," she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with emotion. "He says if it goes well, the position is likely mine. Teaching undergraduate piano students, maybe some performance opportunities with the conservatory's orchestra." "Denise, that's incredible," Richard exclaimed. He also said. She hesitated. "He has a friend who owns an apartment building near the conservatory. Faculty housing. If I get the job, I'd have a place to live." The weight of what this meant hung between them. This was more than a job opportunity. It was a chance for Denise to reclaim her life, to use her gifts again, to have stability and purpose. "You deserve this," Richard said. "All of it." The band began playing and couples moved to the dance floor. Richard held out his hand. "Dance with me?" Denise took his hand and he led her to the floor. As they swayed to the music, he could feel her trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if this is all just a beautiful dream? What if I go to that audition and freeze up? What if I can't do it?" Richard pulled back to look at her. "You will." "I know it. How can you be so sure?" "Because I saw you play," he said simply. "And more importantly, I saw your face while you were playing. That's who you really are, Denise. That talent, that passion, it never left you. It was just waiting for the right moment." As they continued dancing, Richard realized something had changed between them. What had started as a business arrangement, a convenient solution to his pride and her homelessness, had become something neither of them had expected. He cared about what happened to her. He wanted her to succeed, to find her way back to the life she deserved. Later that night, as the reception wound down, they walked together along the path by the lake. The moon cast a silver path across the water, and the sounds of the party faded behind them. "Thank you," Denise said quietly. "For what?" "For this crazy idea that brought me here. For believing I could play again." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "For seeing me as a person, not just a problem to be fixed." Richard took her hand. "I think maybe we fixed each other a little bit." She smiled, and in the moonlight he could see the woman she had been before life had knocked her down. Confident, talented, full of purpose. And maybe, he thought, that was the woman she could be again. What had begun as an impulsive invitation had led to this moment, this possibility of transformation. Neither of them knew exactly what would happen next. But as they stood together under the stars, one thing was certain. Both their lives had changed in ways they never could have predicted when they'd first met outside that cafe just a few weeks ago. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The drive back to the city was quiet. Denise stared out the window, lost in thought, while Richard kept his eyes on the road. The events of the wedding weekend had left them both with a lot to process. "What are you thinking about?" Richard finally asked, breaking the silence. Denise turned to him with a small smile. "Everything. How different my life was just a month ago. How different it might be a month from now." "Are you nervous about the audition?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But also excited. I haven't felt excited about anything in a long time." When they reached the city, Richard pulled up in front of Denise's apartment building. For a moment, neither of them moved to get out of the car. "So," Richard said awkwardly, "our deal is technically complete." Denise nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose it is. But things have changed." "They have." Richard turned to face her. "The audition is on Friday. What do you need to prepare?" Denise looked surprised by the question. "Practice, mainly. I'm rusty. My technique isn't what it was." "Is there a piano in your apartment building?" "No." "Then you'll practice at my place," Richard said decisively. "I have a baby grand I never use. It was my mother's idea of a status symbol." Denise hesitated. "Richard, you've already done so much." "This isn't charity," he interrupted. "This is me being selfish. I want to hear you play again. And I want to see Walter Green's face when he realizes what an incredible talent he's found." After a moment, Denise nodded. "Okay, thank you." The next few days fell into a rhythm. Denise would arrive at Richard's penthouse in the morning. He would leave for work and she would practice for hours. When he returned in the evening, they would have dinner together and she would play for him, asking for his opinions on different interpretations of the pieces she had chosen for her audition. For Richard, coming home to music and conversation was a revelation. His apartment had never felt like a home before, just an expensive place to sleep between workdays. Now it was filled with Beethoven and Chopin, with the smell of cooking and the sound of laughter. On Thursday evening, the night before the audition, Denise played her entire program for Richard. The music flowed from her fingers with confidence and emotion that hadn't been there even a few days before. When she finished, she looked up at him expectantly. "Well?" she asked. "Do I have a chance?" Richard, who had been standing by the window listening, walked over to the piano. "Denise, you're going to blow them away. That wasn't just good, it was extraordinary." She ducked her head, embarrassed by the praise. "I hope you're right. I know I am." He sat beside her on the piano bench. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. Meeting you has changed me. Before I was just going through the motions, measuring my life by my bank account and job title. You reminded me that there's more." Denise was quiet for a moment. "You changed my life too, and not just with the apartment and clothes and opportunity. You made me believe in myself again, made me remember who I was before everything fell apart." Their eyes met, and for a moment Richard thought about closing the distance between them. But the timing didn't feel right. There was too much at stake tomorrow. "You should get some rest," he said instead. "Big day ahead." The next morning, Richard insisted on driving Denise to the Lawrence Conservatory himself, despite having an important meeting scheduled. "Are you sure?" she asked as they pulled away from her apartment. "I don't want you to get in trouble at work." "Let me worry about that," he said. "Some things are more important than quarterly reports." The Lawrence Conservatory was an impressive building of red brick and tall windows. As they walked up the steps, Denise gripped Richard's hand tightly. "You'll be amazing," he assured her. "Just play like you've been playing for me." Walter Green met them in the lobby and led them to a concert hall where 4 other faculty members sat waiting. Richard took a seat in the back row while Denise walked to the grand piano on the stage. She looked small from where he sat, but when she placed her hands on the keys and began to play, she filled the entire hall with sound. Richard watched the faces of the faculty members as they leaned forward in their seats. Clearly impressed by what they were hearing, Denise played 3 pieces: a Bach prelude, a Chopin nocturne, and a contemporary piece Richard didn't recognize. Each showed a different aspect of her skill and musicality. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the faculty broke into applause. Walter approached the stage with a broad smile. "Ms. Williams, that was remarkable. Would you mind stepping outside for a few minutes while we confer?" Richard and Denise waited in the hallway, neither speaking. She paced nervously while he leaned against the wall, watching her. After what seemed like an eternity, Walter opened the door and invited them back in. The other faculty members had left, and he gestured for them to take seats across from his desk. I'll be direct, Walter said, folding his hands on the desk. We would like to offer you the position, Ms. Williams. Full-time faculty starting immediately with summer programs, then a full course load in the fall. Denise's hand flew to her mouth. Really? Really, Walter confirmed with a smile. Your playing speaks for itself, but I was equally impressed by your story. The perseverance you've shown in the face of adversity is exactly the kind of spirit we want to instill in our students. He slid a folder across the desk. This contains the details of the position, including salary and benefits. And as I mentioned, faculty housing is available. As they left the conservatory building, Denise was quiet, clutching the folder to her chest. Are you okay? Richard asked. She nodded, then suddenly threw her arms around him. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered against his shoulder. Richard held her tight. Believe it. You earned this. 2 weeks later, Richard helped Denise move into her new apartment, a small but elegant unit in a building owned by the conservatory. It was nothing like his penthouse, but the joy on Denise's face as she walked through the rooms made it seem like a palace. I have a home, she said, running her hand along the wall as if to convince herself it was real, a real home. And a job doing what you love, Richard added, and a piano. She walked to the upright piano that had been delivered that morning, a gift from Richard, that she had protested but ultimately accepted. She sat down and played a few notes. Richard watched her, thinking about how far they had come from that first meeting outside the cafe. What had started as a business arrangement had become something neither of them had expected. What are you thinking about? Denise asked, noticing his expression. The future, he replied honestly. I was just wondering, now that you have your life back on track, where does that leave us? Denise stopped playing and turned to face him. What do you mean? Richard took a deep breath. I care about you, Denise, more than I expected to. These past weeks, having you in my life, hearing you play, talking with you, it's made me happier than I've been in years. He paused. But I don't want to complicate things for you just when you're getting back on your feet. Denise was quiet for a moment, studying his face. Then she patted the piano bench beside her. Sit with me. He sat down and she took his hand. When you found me on that bench, I had nothing. No home, no hope, no future that I could see. She squeezed his hand. You gave me a chance when no one else would. But do you know what means the most to me? It's not the apartment or the clothes or even this job. It's that you saw me, really saw me, when I was invisible to everyone else. She turned to face him fully. I care about you too, Richard. And I don't think it complicates things. I think maybe it's the simplest thing in all of this. Richard smiled and leaned forward to touch his forehead to hers. So what happens now? Now, Denise said, we take it one day at a time. I teach. You work maybe a little less than before. I play music. You listen. We figure it out together. 6 months later, Richard sat in the front row of the Lawrence Conservatory's main concert hall. The stage was set for the faculty recital, and the program listed Denise Williams as the featured pianist. The hall was packed with students, faculty, and music lovers from across the city. As Denise walked onto the stage in a flowing gown, her head held high with quiet confidence, the audience applauded warmly. She took her seat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the crowd. Her eyes found Richard's and she smiled. Then she began to play. The music that filled the hall was more than just notes on a page. It was the sound of resurrection, of a life reclaimed and renewed. As Richard listened, he thought about the strange path that had brought them here. An impulsive invitation, a weekend wedding, a chance for redemption. Afterward, as they walked hand in hand under the stars, Richard thought about how sometimes the most meaningful connections come from the most unexpected places. How a moment of candidate